It's the most complex organ in the human body and yet allows us to make our lives simple. It feels no pain itself and yet allows us to feel pain. And yes, the more we use it, the less we lose it. That's right, we're talking about the human brain. And today, to help us understand more about its needs, nature and nurturing, we have eminent brain scientist Professor Murrali Doraiswamy with us. Professor Doraiswamy is the Professor of Psychiatry and Medicine at Duke University, USA. Welcome, Professor Doraiswamy, to the program.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Professor, your major area of passion is neuropsychiatry, the brain scientist. Lots of big words, heavy words. We know neurology, we know psychiatry. What is neuropsychiatry?
Neuropsychiatry is where the brain and the mind come together. I think it's the final frontier. There's always been this mystery, does the brain create the mind or does the mind create the brain? The ancient Hindu sages always believed in the mind as the superior organ. The mind rules the brain, the mind rules the body. Whereas the Western philosophy is that the brain is superior, that the brain is creating the mind. In fact, some scientists in the West argue that the mind is an artifact of the brain, and consciousness is an artifact, that we're almost robots programmed through evolution. So I fell in love with neuroscience.
You're deeply passionate about it.
Absolutely. There's a saying about the brain, it's not only the final frontier, but we know very little about it. Most of what we've learned about the brain has occurred in the last 100 years or so. Because if you think about 200 years ago, people thought the heart was the seat of all powers, the seat of all emotions. It's only the last 100 years we've learned everything we know about the brain.
All right. You've done some very interesting work in understanding how our habits and how we think and live our lives, and that can affect the brain and how we become finally.
That's right. It's a two-way street. So we can use our brain to influence our habits and influence our behaviors, but the brain also takes its cues from the environment. Depending on how we structure the environment, we can become victims to the environment. So if we put ourselves in a bad environment, for example, all our friends are drinking and we tend to hang out with our friends who are drinking, then we increases our chances of addiction. If on the other hand, if we are addicted, we have the power within ourselves to recognize that and to change that behavior, but it takes about 6 to 12 weeks for the brain to rewire itself. And the brain is very dynamic. It's constantly rewiring itself. So your behavior dictates how the wiring in your brain changes. Okay. And there's an old saying, neurons that fire together, wire together.
When you talk of the brain and the mind, people have different views. What do you feel?
Well, I think actually the mind is the superior organ, because almost everything in our body can be changed by the mind. People argue that, the brain is the seat of all emotions, but it's not. Today at work, if my boss were to criticize me for something unjustly, I'm deeply hurt. Did my brain do it or did my mind do it? I think it's my mind telling my brain, look, you have this unjust criticism, it's time for me to feel these emotions. And just as easily, we can reverse that cycle. Okay. When you're in love, it's not the brain that falls in love, it's the mind that falls in love, and then your brain adjusts itself and secretes the right hormones so that your body feels like you're in love.
Right. So the brain is a tool?
The brain is a tool of the mind. Absolutely. That's my belief,
okay.
And that's the Indian belief.
All right.
It's not the Western belief.
Right. Because you're saying that a lot of research about the brain has happened in the last 100 years,
right.
But we have thousands of years of knowledge which talks about such a deep understanding of what affects the brain and hence the mind and the consciousness.
Right.
And I think yoga is something that you've also worked upon and seen the effects of yoga on the brain?
Yes, very much so. In fact, we're going a full cycle. So our ancient sages 1,000 years ago realized that, really looking inwards is the true sort of exercise, if you will, for the mind, is the true way to grow ourselves. And then sort of the Western world always focused on looking outwards, materialism, and now our consciousness, we're realizing that we truly need to look inwards, and we're coming full cycle. So yoga has more than 200 effects on the brain and the mind. It's anti-aging benefits. It helps still and calm the mind, helps fight anxiety and depression. It enhances your attention. And more importantly, it socially transforms the person. It increases empathy towards others. It just increases your sense of morality. And at the end of the day, you're looking inwards, and that's where the true growth comes in an individual.
Right. And now studies are proving that, yes, this happens?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. There are probably more than 100 studies that have looked at how yoga affects the brain. What they're finding is that yoga affects many, many chemicals in the brain. It slows the effects of aging on the shrinkage of the brain. Our brain physically shrinks as we get older. And in yoga practitioners, they found that the rate of shrinkage is much slower than in non-practitioners. We've also shown that yoga enhances the relaxation response, which is the opposite of the stress response. And last but not least, we found in a study just very recently conducted at the Chopra Center, led by Deepak Chopra and an international team of scientists from Harvard University, the University of California, San Diego, the University of California, San Francisco, from Mount Sinai School of Medicine, that within a week of starting a yoga meditation course, there are widespread genetic changes, there are widespread cellular changes, and there are changes in something called telomeres. Telomeres are part of our chromosomes that determine our longevity, how long we live. This is the first time that a 1-week yoga Ayurvedic meditation practice has been shown to change a cellular marker of longevity.
Wow.
So we are starting to prove everything that the ancient sages suspected, even though they didn't have the tools to prove it.
I think sad part for us living in a culture here within India that there are certain things we take as practice, tradition, habits, and we tend to shun them because we're saying, where's the proof?
Correct.
You know? And now that proof is coming and validation is coming and we're saying, okay, maybe there's something in it. When we talk of yoga, I think as a tool for social transformation, that's another area that you work deeply on.
Correct.
Do share some findings with us.
There's a fundamental difference between the Western mind and the Eastern mind. You know, the Western mind is very much focused on I, individuality.
Right.
What can I do for myself? Is my house bigger than my neighbor's house? Should I upgrade to an Audi from a Toyota? Whereas the Eastern mind is focused on collective happiness. And one of the very interesting tests that we use to study this is we show a picture, and the picture has 7 children's faces. The child in the middle is very happy, and the children surrounding the child in the middle are unhappy. And the person is asked to rate the happiness of the child in the middle. And what we find is the typical Western person rates the person in the middle as very happy.
Okay.
Whereas the typical Eastern person takes the average happiness of everybody in the picture and rates the person in the middle as less happy. And what we have shown is that when you put Westerners through a Eastern yoga meditation type practice, they change how they view individuality versus collective happiness. And they start taking into account collective happiness more. That's one. The second thing we found is there is a part in our brain called the temporoparietal junction. It's kind of found somewhere in the side of our heads, just above our ears, deep into the brain. One side of that controls morality. And the other side, there's 2 temporoparietal junctions. On the other side, it sort of leads to out-of-body experiences.
Okay.
And we found that those are 2 regions that yoga seems to influence particularly. So in a scenario where experimental subjects are asked, would you push a person off of a bridge? That's the morality center that is making that decision. And we found that yoga actually tightens and enhances the circuits in that morality center so that a person becomes more moral, less likely to start wars, less likely to kill other beings.
Again, we say, this whole bit about dividing the brain, a lot of people say that there's the right part of the brain and
Correct.
the left part of the brain.
That's right.
If you're more artistic, if you're inclined towards logistics,
Yeah.
is there a difference? Is there a division? How does that work?
Yes, we do have 2 brains, and there are fibers that connect the right side and the left side. And interestingly, in women, the right and the left brains are far more extensively connected than they are in men. And that's what makes women better communicators, better listeners, probably better, cognitively overall, though they don't get the credit for it.
I have to stop smiling. Okay.
So the right-left differences in terms of creativity versus logical thinking are slightly exaggerated, but they are true. The left brain is more analytical. The right brain somehow takes a look at the big picture. So it's looking at the forest, whereas the left brain is analyzing how many trees there are in the forest. So yes, but yoga has an effect on both sides of the brain. And introspective meditation activates a part of the brain called the default network. It's a very complicated term. What people have found in neuroscience is that when you're at rest, the resting brain is actually far more active than any of us imagined. And the brain is actually able to use all of its resources to try to solve problems. So that may actually be one way in which meditation works, because when you're not focusing externally, the brain is not just honed in on one particular task or one particular problem. It's able to use all of its internal resources, draw on everything. It's almost like you're drawing on the whole office inside your brain to solve a particular problem. That's why daydreamers come up with such amazing solutions to problems. And people are now actively recommending daydreaming in the office for 15-20 minutes to try to solve problems.
When we have structure and built-in checks and balances to lead a so-called structured life as per norms, we are not allowing our brain to grow.
That's right. And the brain is a tool. So it's if you're really focused on one task, the brain devotes all its resources just honing in there. Okay. You're not letting it free associate. And the brain has an incredible ability to solve its own problems. In fact, that's what it does at night when we're sleeping.
That means sleep patterns play a very important role in how we live, eat and breathe.
Correct.
And think also?
Correct.
Okay.
We underestimate sleep. And people have discovered a brand new system in the brain that comes alive only at nighttime when we're asleep. It's called the glymphatic system. So it's not your blood circulatory system, it's not the lymphatic system, it's called the glymphatic system. So it's a technical word, but the bottom line is it's a trash collector. So it's almost like in the US, every night we leave out our garbage bags outside, and at night a truck comes and picks up all our trash. And that's the same system we have in the brain. During the daytime, a lot of biochemical reactions generate unwanted products. And these products are all picked up at night to be recycled for manufacturing proteins, for chemicals, hormones, etc. So if you don't get enough sleep at night, the recycling doesn't happen. The trash collector doesn't have time to clear out all the trash. Wow. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we also consolidate and archive all our daily learnings at night. In studies in laboratory animals, what they found is if you teach a rat how to successfully navigate a maze, when the rat is sleeping at night, the brain is rehearsing that pattern thousands of times so that it becomes fixed behavior. Okay. The same thing probably happens in humans. So if you learn today how to do something new, like ride a bicycle as a child, your brain is rehearsing that pattern at night. And the brain also stores our memories in the right place. So it's almost like you're returning a book into a library, and at night the librarian is putting the books away in the right shelves. Okay. Because if the books are not correctly placed, the next morning you won't be able to pull it back. So that's why if you don't sleep well, our IQ drops by 8 points the next day. Our cognitive performance can drop by about 25-30% the next day without one night's sleep.
There is this increasing trend in young people to change the times at when they sleep.
Correct.
So is night sleep as good as day sleep, or is there a difference there?
Well, there are two different types of individuals. These are called chronotypes, or different sleep patterns. So some people sort of sleep late at night. Some people go to bed early at night and they wake up early in the morning. Other people sort of are, they perform best late at night. So there are two different circadian patterns, and they appear to be completely differently genetically driven.
Okay.
Ultimately, nighttime sleep is the best in the dark, because what happens is there are two chemicals in our body, serotonin and melatonin. right? The pineal gland, which our sages actually thought was the third eye. And that's why we look at the sun. Surya Namaskar is a practice. What happens when you wake up in the morning and you look directly at the sun? The sun gets into your eye. There's a nerve that goes from the eye to the pineal gland. And the pineal gland converts melatonin into serotonin to get you ready for the day. And at night, when the sun sets, the pineal gland converts all the serotonin into melatonin to prepare you for bedtime. So the best time to sleep and wake up is coinciding with the rise and fall of the sun.
So beautiful that the human nature is, and the body is so beautifully synced with the nature outside.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Coming back to the brain and understanding memory loss.
Yes.
Alzheimer's is a disease which is spreading across the world and affecting more and more people.
Yes.
Even the age barrier is being broken. Younger and younger people are getting it. How do we distinguish between benign memory loss and that memory loss which is alarming?
So most memory loss that happens in people in their 20s, 30s, 40s is probably not Alzheimer's. It's due to stress, it's due to anxiety. We have a saying, if you're not paying attention, if you're not encoding something, you can't remember it the next day because the brain has not registered it properly. And most of the time we are multitasking, we're not really focusing on what we are listening to. Of course, the brain thinks it's not important and it's not registering that information. So I would say 70-80% of forgetfulness in people in their middle life is due to that. It's benign. And a cue to that is a lot of times when we forget something and it pops back into you when you're not trying to remember it. So a name of a person, we're trying very hard to pull up a name, it doesn't come, we give up, and then later in the day you're doing something else and that name pops back. If it does that, then that's a sign that the memory problem is benign. It has to do more with attention. It has to do with the fact that that name is not stored in the right place. It's like a book that's been misshelved.
Okay.
The true sign of Alzheimer's is if somebody is starting to have worsening memory that gets progressively worse for 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, it's starting to affect their daily lives. And even with hints and cues, they cannot remember what they forgot. So the saying is, if you cannot remember what you forgot, then that's a sign of more serious memory loss. Okay. So if you can't remember a name, even if I give you choices of 3-4 names and you can't pick out the right one from those, then it's a worrisome problem.
All right. So what triggers Alzheimer's or memory loss?
We don't fully understand what triggers Alzheimer's disease. It's, as you pointed out, it's a huge public health problem in the West. And I think if Indians don't manage their lives well, it could become a problem here as well, because aging is the single biggest risk factor. The longer we live, the more likely we are to get Alzheimer's disease. There is a buildup of certain abnormal plaques in the brain. It's not the same plaque that blocks our arteries in our heart. It's not the plaque that builds up in our teeth. It's a different plaque, and it appears to jam the communication between nerve cells. So we don't understand why this plaque builds up. But what we now have are some new brain scans that can detect the buildup of this plaque. And what we are finding is that plaque starts building up in our brains 15 to 20 years before Alzheimer's is fully sort of manifest. So in your 40s or 50s, plaque could start building up.
Okay.
And then you get Alzheimer's in your 70s. There are several vaccines that are in development. We are one of the sites that are testing it. But again, I think the key is things such as a healthy lifestyle. What's good for the heart is good for the brain. Preventing strokes, preventing head injuries. Meditation is very good because it strengthens the brain and it makes the brain more resistant to diseases of aging.
Professor Doraiswamy, talking of Alzheimer's, memory loss, and you saying it's starting earlier and earlier, and we can look out for signs, but what can we do well to prevent and love and look after our brain and prevent the onset of such stuff?
It's a brilliant question, and it's something that all of us need to pay attention to, because none of us are immune from getting diseases of brain aging. Unfortunately, there's no magic bullet to prevent Alzheimer's for sure, because we don't know what causes it. But there are at least 7 things that each one of us can do to keep our brains healthy and to lower our risk for getting Alzheimer's. The first thing is really knowledge. You need to be aware of what are all the risk factors that you yourself have. Do you have a family history of Alzheimer's, in which case you're much more prone to getting it? Do you have risk factors such as head injury? Have you hurt your head in a motorcycle accident, or have you hurt your head in like a football game? You need to make sure that you protect your head with a helmet. People with a head injury have a 2 or 3 times greater risk for getting Alzheimer's disease. Heart health. You need to watch that all of your numbers are in the right range. So numbers such as blood pressure, cholesterol, body weight, and blood sugar. Because all of the things that are bad for your heart are bad for your brain and may increase your risk for Alzheimer's. So for example, if you have a lot of obesity in your stomach, in your midsection, there is an inverse correlation with memory. So the part of the brain that processes memory shrinks the more the weight that you gain. So anything you can do to keep yourself fit from a heart point of view, such as exercise, 3 times a week for at least 30 minutes a day walking. You know, I like to joke that a walk a day keeps Alzheimer's away, just like that old saying, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. So now a walk a day. The second thing that's very useful in terms of heart is diet. Generally avoid overeating, smaller portions, eat 3 or 4, sort of small meals a day rather than big mega meals. Avoid a lot of saturated fats, anything that's fried foods, heavy in ghee, that kind of stuff, try to avoid it. Eat a lot of colored vegetables, anything, red, green. The more colors there are on your plate, the more antioxidants you get. And antioxidants are very good for the brain because they help the brain get rid of toxins. Keep your brain active and act young. There are studies that show that the more active you are, the more different and novel things you try, whether it be Sudoku, whether it be chess, whether it be competitive bridge playing, all of those things make your brain more resistant. It's almost like you have more cell phone towers. And even if one tower is damaged, you will never drop a call. The last thing is social networks. So social networks protect your brain. In fact, the brain thrives on social support. The more friends, the more relationships, the more close family ties you have, the stronger your brain is, and the stronger your brain can resist the effects of aging.
You also talk very positively about positive reinforcement and positive thinking.
That's right.
So if you're more empathetic, you're with people who are happier,
correct,
then that helps the brain?
Very much so. And what we are discovering, all of us, we all know sort of social media and social networks.
Right.
It turns out that everything about our life health spreads in social networks. If you hang out with skinny people, you tend to be more skinny. If you hang out with bright people, you tend to be more bright. And it spreads to 3 degrees in your social network. Happiness spreads to 3 degrees. It's not surprising because all these emotions are contagious. And the last but not least is, I think, meditation.
Going back to one point about food, and there's so many fad diets and what's good for you. Sometimes you really don't know what to eat and what not to eat. But there is something we all suffer, most of us, from, is comfort eating. We don't eat for the stomach, we eat for comforting ourselves. And that, I'm sure, is linked to the brain.
Yes, very much so. And it's an excellent point. Stress eating is what we call it. So we use food to medicate ourselves. So you need to be aware of that, because when you're under chronic, long-lasting stress, stress resets your brain's appetite center. And you get a craving for carbohydrate-rich foods, sugary foods that provide instant boosts of sugar to the brain. And sugar almost acts, it's almost like you're addicted to sugar. So
that's the sugar high or the sugar rush?
That's the sugar high or the sugar rush. You get spikes, high and low, and those are bad for the brain, because when you get the highs, you feel euphoric and great, but then when the sugar goes down, you get irritable and you become like a junkie wanting another fix. So that's why it's really important to eat what we call as complex carbohydrates that slowly release sugar. So these tend to be fruits, these tend to be things like brown rice instead of white rice. Avoid fried stuff, avoid like your pure cornflakes, but instead go for mueslix or go for oatmeal or bran or things like that that release it slowly. But that also brings up the point about stress, because we all need stress. Acute stress increases our attention and helps our survival. It's what helps us get out of the way of a snake. If we see a snake on the path, instantly our body triggers a stress response, and before we can even think, we remove our foot from it. But our modern day office and our modern day life has become such that we are being exposed to stress multiple times a day. Our body can only cope for 10 seconds at a time. It was built for like a 10-second stress episode. It was not built for 20 episodes of stress in a given day. And as a result, what happens is your cortisol level goes up. Cortisol is the stress hormone. And when cortisol levels go up, you become overeating, you become obese, it starts affecting your heart, it increases your heart rate, increases your blood sugar, you put on weight, it reduces your immunity, you become more vulnerable to infections. And in the brain, it actually shrinks your brain, it reduces your attention, reduces your memory, and it damages your memory centers physically. So that's why it's so important to recognize if you are in a high stress state continuously, you need to take a break. You need downtime, you need to rechange your environment, you need family time, and that's where meditation can totally reset your stress levels.
Right. The different organs of our body, from the heart to the kidney to the liver, they do give us indications as to when something is going wrong.
Yes.
How does the brain talk to us?
Well, the brain talks to us through something called hot and cold cognition. There are two states of the brain. Hot cognition is when we make decisions under stress, under intense emotions. For example, you get an email that's really upsetting, and then without thinking, boom, you reply to that person, and then 10 minutes later you regret it. So that's called hot cognition. Cold cognition is your very rational, logical thinking. So one of the first things is if you realize that you're under severe sort of emotions, step back. Recognize that it hijacks your rational thinking. And imagine, one of the ways that we can actually get around it is imagine you're making decisions for someone else. And that instantly cools you down. And you're much more like, there's a distance from that. Or of course, take a break. You know, don't send emails when you're angry. You know, go for a walk in the woods and come back. Really, the way the brain sends you the signals is it affects your cognition. You tend to become more instinctive. It's almost like the reptilian brain reacting rather than a human brain. And then anxiety, depression, irritability, lack of sleep, all these are classic signs that someone is under a lot of stress.
I think in the brain, we also need to listen to what people around us are telling us about ourselves.
That's right.
That feedback will also help us say, okay, now,
very much so.
I need to look at that.
Very much so, I agree, because stress affects everybody around us. You need to be aware of that, and you need to be more mindful. That's the key word, I think, there. We need to be more mindful of the state that we are in.
Aging is something we're all concerned with.
Yes.
And I think more than the physical aspect, there is also the internal aspect of the aging of our organs.
Right.
And you also say that the brain, though it shrinks, can always be renewed by undertaking so many activities. We can keep our brain young.
That's right.
And you're doing some wonderful work related to this with the Chopra Center also.
That's right. So there's good news with aging. You know, it's not all bad. You know, wisdom, there are many things that actually improve with aging. Wisdom is one of those. We also become much more emotionally stronger as we age. We are less likely to be sort of affected adversely by emotions. A younger person, for example, you know, with a breakup, all of a sudden they have a temper tantrum, whereas an older person would be much wiser. The things that go down with aging are short-term memory, names, and the speed at which we process information.
Okay.
And there are ways to fix it. And so one of the groundbreaking projects that the Chopra Center is undertaking is called SBTI. These are initials for an acronym. They stand for Self-Directed Biological Transformation Initiative. So can we use the power of the mind to transform our body? And there have been several studies, as we discussed, about yoga and how yoga affects it. But none of those studies have been comprehensive, looking at head to foot, how it affects every aspect of your body. we are measuring multiple things. We are using sensors like the Fitbit sensor or the sensors that people wear to measure their activity level. We are doing cardiovascular sensors to see how your heart is affected. We're doing psychological measurements of the brain, looking at stress, looking at sleep, looking at spirituality, wisdom, decision making. We're also looking at genetics. You know, the body has something like 30,000 genes, and the genetic expression can be measured in different tissues. So we're taking a blood sample to map the genetic changes that meditation induces. We're also looking at something called telomeres, which is a molecular marker of how long you may live, longevity. And it's a collaboration between several leading institutions in the US. So Deepak Chopra is the lead investigator. The second lead investigator is Dr. Rudy Tanzi from Harvard Medical School. He's a renowned geneticist. There's a cardiologist, Dr. Eric Topol from the Scripps Research Institute. There's a Nobel laureate from the University of California, San Francisco, who actually her team discovered telomeres and how they can serve as a marker for longevity. There is a leading mathematician and informatics guru from Mount Sinai University, and then there's my team from Duke University. So there's a big group of researchers, and there's a huge value in collaboration. And the results of this study will come out sometime early next year, and I think it'll transform the field. It's the first study that is going to prove almost conclusively what a short course of meditation, yoga, and Ayurvedic practice has, what it does to the entire body.
And at some level, I think the medical fraternity believes that there is a close link, because so many people of such great importance and knowledge are coming together for this project.
Correct, absolutely. I think Westerners need to see this kind of data, and the collaboration of these Ivy League schools with the renowned Chopra Center led by Deepak Chopra. I think it'll bring enormous credibility, and it'll be transformative to the field. I think it's full cycle, as I pointed out. What our sages have always known thousands of years ago now is going to be hopefully proven by this study, and the great thing about it is it's being led by an Indian, Chopra.
I think also about belief and faith, it's that one tumbler. So once that tumbler falls into place, then there is so much more information that is available for thousands of years, which will then all get validation. Not that it needs it, but I think for the modern mind and modern man, it needs that validation, which is going to start a virtuous cycle of learning.
That's right. Growth. It's called the tipping point. You know, once you reach that tipping point, we hope that this will lead to many other studies. We hope that this will lead to government agencies in multiple countries starting large-scale programs. And what I personally would like to see is a global study where, you know, we can use the internet to conduct a study of, say, 100 million people in, 200 countries around the world, where everyone is meditating and inputting their own data into the internet, and you can actually do a global study of that sort. And I hope this will trickle down then to the youth, teenagers, the elderly, so corporate businessmen. So I think this has very wide-ranging impact.
Coming to the Indian context,
yes,
we are a growing nation. We are the youngest nation in the world. We have our own challenges. In terms of challenges related to brain development and how we see mental health in India, what are some things we need to look out for?
There are studies that have shown that if you're depressed, not only do you not perform well in school or work, not only does it rub off on your family, but it rubs off on every organ in your system. You're more likely to get heart attacks, you're more likely to get flus and infections, women are more likely to get thinning of the bones, you're more likely to get cognitive problems. So really, I think mental health and mental well-being has to be right up there as one of the top priorities. Now, India has a shortage of trained mental health professionals relative to the West. The ratio of trained mental health professionals to the population with mental health problems, it's a very small numbers in India. So we have to find a way to dramatically enhance that. The second thing is education. Many people sort of with mental health issues still face stigma. they often end up going to non-traditional sources, getting wrong advice or bad advice, or they end up being frustrated and commit suicide because they cannot find anywhere to seek help. So I think telepsychiatry is going to be very important, using new technologies so that, imagine you can have one psychiatrist in a metropolitan area, and that psychiatrist is available for consultation through telepsychiatry, through telemedicine in any village. So it would be very important to set up a national network of telepsychiatry. The other thing is we can train local mental health professionals. They need not be doctors. They can be counselors, they can be social workers, they can be psychologists. I think we really need to enhance the numbers of such individuals available for counseling, available for biofeedback, available for behavioral therapies, etc. And ultimately, I think we're going to need to change the environment, because a children's brain and a children's vulnerability to mental illnesses starts very early. We need to reduce the cycle of violence. Children exposed to violence, children who are refugees, children who grow up in these traumatic sort of neighborhoods are much more likely to develop mental illnesses. Nourishment. The brain needs nourishment early on, so when the mother gets good nourishment during pregnancy and when the child gets good nourishment in the first few years of life, much less likelihood of developing mental health problems later on. So all of these things, I think, need to come together. And I think I'm confident that the new government is going to put this as a high priority.
You're a part of a huge growing community which has contributed, maybe initially at a country's level, but now the work that you're doing is contributing at an international level.
Right.
It's reaching and going across boundaries. How do you see India as a resource center? Because this is the country that you did your medical school from and did your master's outside.
Yeah.
So how does that work in the future?
I think India can be a leader very easily because, one, we have some of the brightest people, I think, on the planet. I think despite all the criticisms, our education system is one of the strongest in the world. If you look at the contributions Indians are making in Silicon Valley, I mean, Indians are now, an Indian is the CEO of Microsoft, an Indian is the CEO of Adobe, an Indian was the CEO of Citibank, an Indian is the CEO of Pepsi. I think the limits are all set in our own mind. I think we need to really integrate the global Indian fraternity with the local Indian fraternity. We need to think more innovatively because we've been a service industry in the global era, for example, in computers. We've really been very good at servicing other computer companies, but less good at innovating our own products. So I think what we need to do right from a young age is to teach children not just rote learning, but also problem-solving skills and help them how to innovate and develop new products. I just read today about this, I think it was like a 13-year-old boy who developed a new device for helping stroke patients talk better. Until now, we were only hearing about these kinds of development by kids in the Western world. I think, there's no shortage of Indian kids who can do this kind of stuff. If we can create the right atmosphere, produce the right sort of resources, I'm very optimistic that India is going to become a huge, huge leader very soon. And I think the government has to play a right role in providing the resources, the right policies. I'm very optimistic.
Wonderful. So what do you think are some new treatments on the anvil which will really change how we see mental health?
To me, the biggest change in mental health has to come really at a public health level. I think new drugs and new pills are fine for treating people who already have illnesses, but I think the biggest change is going to come from preventing illnesses rather than sort of trying to treat it when a person is already psychotic or depressed, etc. But that said, I would say there are several new techniques that are coming out. For example, in the area of depression, there's a new gadget that's called a brain stimulation device. There are certain circuits in the brain that determine our mood. Now, of course, I'm not saying that the brain determines our mood. Our mind determines our mood to a large extent, but the brain is a tool and the brain manifests these. So you can actually use this machine to stimulate certain parts of the brain, and some parts of the brain make you happy and some parts of the brain make you sad. So we may soon have these personal gadgets that we wear on our head like a headset, and it's delivering little jolts. If you stimulate the right part of the brain, it can improve your memory. If you stimulate another part of your brain, it can make you happier. You stimulate another part of your brain, it can make you more alert. The Navy and the Air Force in the US are already testing these gadgets because, for example, in pilots, you don't want a sleepy pilot. So they're using these, it's a brain stimulation device.
Like
so
an EP, electronic pill.
Exactly, it's like an electronic
Targeted,
pill. I'm not saying this is a long-term solution, but I'm just showing where things are heading. But I think ultimately the solution has to come not from pills, not from electronic devices or gadgets. It has to come from within. The placebo effect is perhaps the most underutilized effect in all of medicine, in all of mental health. The mind has all of the chemicals needed to heal itself. There are studies, for example, that have shown that you give somebody a placebo pill, it can relieve pain just as much as an expensive pain pill. There was a very interesting experiment where doctors gave a group of two groups of individuals. One group with pain was given a cheap pain pill. They were told this pain pill only costs like 10 paisa. And another group was given a pain pill, and they were told this pain pill is an expensive pain pill. It's brand new pain pill, costs 100 rupees a pill. And the group that got the 100 rupee pain pill experienced more pain relief. But what the two groups didn't know is that both groups were given a dummy placebo pill.
Okay.
Just thinking that you're getting an expensive pill relieves your pain.
Okay.
So I think the placebo effect, which is really your ability to heal yourself, is something we haven't tapped into, and that's something we need to tap into. And meditation, yoga practices, the very act of hugging someone relieves pain just as much as a pain pill.
Right.
When you smile, you cannot feel sad while you're smiling, because your face is sending a signal to the brain saying, I'm smiling.
No time to be sad.
No time to be sad.
Okay.
So they're all interconnected. And that's where positive psychology comes in. If you're thinking positive, if you're thinking the glass is half full, your brain automatically adjusts itself. Doing things like being generous, being grateful, counting your blessings, all of these things are a way of thinking, and they kind of combat the automatic negative thoughts.
Do you meditate?
I do meditate. I don't meditate in a group. I just meditate at home on my own, and most of my meditation is just sitting quietly where I can view a wonderful garden scenery or nature, because I don't think we were born to meditate inside four walls. I think we need to meditate where we know we're sitting as one and part of nature, because we came from stars. We are made of stardust, and the closer we are to nature, I think the effects of meditation are much stronger. And I meditate for about 20 minutes a day. The first 10 minutes is usually a lot of thoughts come through, work issues, home issues, problem solving, etc. But then at least another 10 minutes or so, fairly quiet. Sometimes I say some mantras like the Gayatri mantra, or other times I don't. And I think it's very rejuvenating for me to do that.
So wanting to understand from a brain scientist that when you're meditating and the brain and the mind are really working to make sure that you don't meditate, because so much of stuff is coming in and out.
Correct.
How does one manage that?
Well, I think through practice to some extent, because you have to quieten the mind, and quietening the mind, like everything else, is a learned behavior. It's not something you can do the first day you start. It's a little bit like studying. How do you study with music? And we learn how to do that. And I think we can quieten the mind. It takes some practice. There's not a specific technique other than some distractions. So that's where I think the mantras come in handy. I'm not saying that's the only reason mantras were created, because I think mantras also, like you point out, have a very profound effect. The meaning connects us and transforms us in other ways.
The syllable and the sound has a different
syllable
effect,
and the sound. But anything, it could be a mantra, it can be listening to very soft music in the background. Those things tend to shut out, unwanted thoughts from coming in.
As we grow older, the propensity or the ability to meditate, is it better with age, or it has nothing to do with age?
I think meditation benefits the old and the young in different ways slightly, right? Because young people are much more likely to multitask and they need to focus on something. I think meditation helps them look inwards and reduces their sort of addiction to multitasking and looking at gadgets. With older people, I think the brain is, going through some changes, reduced blood supply, maybe some shrinkage, and I think meditation helps reverse a lot of those age-related changes. So it strengthens the older brain, it strengthens the younger brain, slightly different ways.
Right. What are your views on this debate of focusing on one task vis-a-vis multitasking?
It's always better to focus on one task.
Okay.
But there's a difference. There's two generations. There's what's called as a digital generation. These are kids who were born and brought up with the iPads and the iPhones. I think there's some emerging signs that they are much more able to multitask because their brains are being rewired slightly. Whereas most of us who grew up without these gadgets, focusing on one task at a time is probably much, much better. When we multitask, it's a state called continuous partial attention. Our ability to perform at a peak drops by about 25-30%. So we're not able to do either task equally well.
Right.
And if you're constantly multitasking, then you develop a condition that's called attention deficit trait. It's not attention deficit disorder, the disorder that teenagers get and kids get that require treatment from a psychiatrist.
Right.
But it's a personality trait where you become more irritable, you're less organized, you're not able to complete any one thing, you're constantly shifting from one thing to another. So it's almost like your brain shifts into that state as a way of coping with this constant flood of information. So it's the best way to manage that is meditate, focus on one thing at a time and avoid the temptation. In fact, there's a new device in America that's come out. It's called the cell phone jail. It's a small like a device. It has bars. You can take all your family's cell phones and iPads, put it inside it, and once you lock it and set the timer, there's no way you can break it open until the correct time is over. So dinner time, other times when everybody's looking at gadgets, nobody is focusing, I would recommend doing that. And once you start doing that, the brain sort of retrains itself.
Right. You're talking of rewiring the brain and how we live, changing the genetic structure that we have or the order. That means how we live and behave today is going to affect future generations?
If you just look at the brain, for example, there's almost 100 billion nerve cells. Each one of these nerve cells makes more than 10,000 connections. There's more connections than there are stars in the universe. And each one of these connections is being rewired constantly.
Okay.
And when these connections are rewired, it also changes us biochemically, it changes us genetically. And that phenomenon is called epigenetics. So epigenetics is our environment can determine whether our genes manifest themselves in certain ways or in other ways. And then once we change our genes, those become hereditary, and some of these can actually be passed on to future generations.
That means today when we think of collecting a lot of stuff to pass on to future generations, this is the biggest investment we can make to say, I need to change my gene structure in a better manner to pass that on.
Correct. If you change your brain, you can change your life. Wonderful. And if you change the way you live, you can change what you're passing on to future generations.
Wonderful. Professor Doraiswamy, you've actually, by coming on this show, changed many things in how we think and approach this complex organ which we're riding on throughout our lives and throughout the days. But thank you so much for giving us different perspectives and actually broadening our horizons and maybe changing a gene or two? I don't know.
Possibly.
Possibly.
Thank you so much, and it's been such a pleasure to be on your show.
Thank you so much. Thank you.